whirlwind of mystery began on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the heir to an immense fortune vanished without a trace. 20-year-old James Harrington, son of the prominent real estate mogul George Harrington, was last seen leaving his family's lavish estate in Glendale. Friends shrugged it off as a spontaneous getaway, yet days stretched into a week with no word from him. At first, whispers spoke of kidnapping, blackmail, even orchestrated revenge. As the frantic search intensified, disturbing secrets began to rise to the surface, secrets that threatened to tear the prestigious Harrington family apart. Where was James? And why did he disappear? George Harrington was not a man who ever took no for an answer. Born to middle-class parents in upstate New York, he built his real estate empire, Harrington Enterprises, from a small corner office in Glendale into a national powerhouse. By the time he was 40, George had made the Forbes list of the richest Americans, an accomplishment he relished. Perhaps it was that drive, that ferocious ambition, which shaped him into the proud, sometimes overbearing father he was known to be. He wanted only the best for his one and only child, James Harrington. Caroline Harrington, George's wife, hailed from a family of old money in Boston. Refined, graceful, and highly educated, she had studied art history at Wellesley. When the two met at a fundraiser for an underprivileged youth program, it was an instant spark. George found her poise irresistible, and Caroline found his unstoppable ambition exhilarating. They married within a year and soon had James. The Harringtons, from the outside, seemed to epitomize the American dream, a grand estate, philanthropic endeavors, and a well-respected name in elite circles. James was a bright young man with a penchant for creativity. He found solace in painting and a love for photography rather than the business deals and boardrooms that so mesmerized his father. When he turned 18, George had tried to ease him into the family empire, suggesting a summer internship at Harrington Enterprises, encouraging him to attend corporate retreats. Yet, James felt an odd sense of suffocation amid the business suits and economic forecasts. By his sophomore year in college, he was enrolled at a prestigious art institute in California, far from the corporate world. Tensions between father and son simmered beneath the surface, but on the outside, the Harringtons kept up appearances. The Glendale estate, often featured in architectural magazines, was a sprawling mansion with manicured lawns, a state-of-the-art security system, and a legion of staff. Visitors often marveled at the impeccably designed interiors, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and original paintings by European masters. George prided himself on his collection of rare art pieces, which he flaunted at society galas whenever possible. Among the many employees on the estate was a longtime caretaker named William Stark, a discreet gentleman who had served the family for over 2 decades. William was responsible for the smooth running of the household, liaising with security, managing the kitchen staff, and overseeing any repairs. He treated James like his own child, often quietly sharing stories about his own youth when James seemed troubled. Then there was the family chauffeur, Henry Gibson, who drove James wherever he wished, always mindful of the delicate father-son dynamic. Henry had observed, without comment, the unspoken pressure James felt to live up to his father's immense legacy. While father and son loved each other, their visions for James's future diverged greatly. The tension, however, never overshadowed the Harrington name until one fateful evening. No one anticipated that, in the blink of an eye, James would disappear, leaving behind a swirl of rumors, fear, and looming darkness about what truly happened. On a mild September evening, James exchanged terse words with his father in the elegant living room, its gleaming floors reflecting the tension between them. George had once again tried to nudge James into attending a high-profile real estate conference the following week, suggesting it would be a good experience and an essential introduction to the business. James, exhausted from repeating the same argument, declined firmly. Caroline attempted to mediate, lightly resting a hand on her husband's shoulder, but the conversation ended with a frustrated silence that left a chilly unease in the room. James retreated upstairs to his spacious bedroom, its large windows overlooking the meticulously trimmed hedges. He stared at the city lights in the distance, weighed down by the feeling that his life was heading in a direction he did not choose. He typed a few messages on his phone, no one knows to whom exactly, and then turned off the lamp. A security camera on the front porch later captured him stepping outside around midnight, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and jeans as though heading for a casual stroll. Early the next morning, Caroline realized James hadn't come down for breakfast. Initially, she assumed he was sleeping in, a trait not uncommon for him on weekends. By lunchtime, concern nagged at her. She went upstairs, knocked on his door, and found it empty. Neatly folded on the bed was James's favorite jacket, a detail that struck Caroline as odd, because James rarely went anywhere without that jacket. His wallet lay on the bedside table, along with his phone charger, but the phone itself was missing. Panicked, Caroline alerted George, who promptly initiated a flurry of calls, first to James's friends, then to local hospitals, and finally to the Glendale Police Department. When told there was no immediate sign of foul play, George's frustration bubbled over. He demanded the authorities take the matter seriously. A wealthy and well-connected man, he pressured them to dispatch investigators right away. By sunset, Detective John Stevens of the Glendale Police Department arrived at the Harrington estate. Stevens was known for solving tough cases in the area, from high-profile art thefts to the disappearance of local heiresses. Though he tried to maintain composure, even he couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. There was no forced entry, no ransom note, nothing to indicate a standard kidnapping. Yet, the nature of James's disappearance, his phone left behind or switched off, was deeply perplexing. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the mansion escalated. Caroline paced the halls, eyes rimmed red from crying, while George wrestled with guilt. "I should have talked to him more gently," he kept muttering. William Stark hovered discreetly in the background, offering comforting words to his distraught employers, while Henry Gibson was sent to retrace James's possible route, scouring the nearby streets and hangouts. No sign of James, no calls, no texts. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving everyone to question how and why he disappeared at all. In the days following James's mysterious vanishing act, George Harrington mobilized every resource at his disposal. The Glendale police performed their standard investigation, but George, never one to rely solely on public institutions, hired Anderson Investigations, a private security and detective agency led by Natalie Anderson, a resolute woman famous for her meticulous investigative methods. Natalie's name carried weight. She had previously solved a string of high-profile missing person cases, working discreetly for tech billionaires and Hollywood elites. She arrived at the Harrington mansion armed with a small team of seasoned detectives. Their first step involved thorough interviews with the household staff. William Stark reported the last time he saw James was that evening, walking across the living room with a troubled expression. Henry Gibson confirmed he was off duty that night and had gone home. The security footage revealed James slipping out around midnight, but the cameras did not show where he went once he passed beyond the estate's tall iron gates. Next, Natalie combed through James's room. A practiced eye, she looked for anything amiss, a photo pinned crookedly to the corkboard, a piece of paper left in a pants pocket. Tucked in a desk drawer, she found a crumpled note with hastily scrawled words, "I can't do this anymore. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched some of James's older letters that Caroline kept in a family scrapbook. That small note set her heart pounding with dread. Did James intend to run away? Or was it some distressed reflection? Meanwhile, Detective John Stevens collaborated with the Glendale police to review phone logs. James's smartphone pinged at a tower near downtown Glendale around 2:00 a.m. the night he disappeared, but after that, it went dark. No outgoing calls, no texts. Given James's privileged upbringing, there was speculation about whether someone might have coerced him. Stevens, however, found no record of kidnappers contacting the Harringtons for ransom, an odd detail in a case involving the son of a millionaire. With each passing day, theories multiplied. Online gossip forums, fueled by the family's high profile, buzzed with speculation. Some alleged James was kidnapped for ransom, others claimed he was escaping a controlling father. A few even wondered if James had been involved with unscrupulous characters who might have harmed him. In the midst of this chaos, George's anxiety soared. He barked at staff, obsessively demanded updates from Natalie, and berated the local police for their lack of progress. Caroline, on the other hand, sank into a quiet anguish. She neglected her usual social circles and philanthropic luncheons, drifting in a fog of worry. Late at night, she wandered into James's room, gently touching his art supplies, a half-finished canvas. Painting of a serene mountain lake stood on his easel, the paint still not fully dry. Natalie's team worked around the clock, analyzing James's bank statements, checking local bus station cameras, and questioning every acquaintance they could track down. Still, the puzzle of James Harrington's disappearance yielded no immediate answers, only fragments of a life that seemed abruptly cast aside. And the next revelation would only deepen the sense of dread enveloping the Harrington household. As the investigation plodded forward, unexpected details began surfacing about James's life. One lead pointed to Rachel Summers, a quiet art student who attended the same college as James. She had been close to him for several months, though the Harringtons, especially George, knew little of her existence. Eager to find any clue, Natalie arranged a discreet meeting with Rachel at a local cafe. The young woman showed up wearing a worried expression, gripping a sketchbook as if for comfort. "I haven't seen James since the night before he disappeared," Rachel confessed, her voice trembling. They had argued that evening. According to Rachel, James felt trapped under the weight of his father's expectations. "He told me he was suffocating," she whispered, "like he was living someone else's dream, not his own. I tried to calm him down, but he was so distraught." Rachel also mentioned seeing James huddled in heated conversation with an older man named Miguel Serrano a few days prior. She didn't know much about Miguel, only that he wasn't a student, and the exchange ended in raised voices. Rachel suspected it involved money. When pressed for details, Rachel said James seemed desperate. He was short on cash, she added, eyes darting nervously, and he said his father never took him seriously, never gave him any freedom with finances. This revelation startled Natalie. Why would the son of a millionaire need money badly enough to approach someone outside his usual social circle? Suspicions about gambling or illicit deals bubbled to the surface. Natalie passed on the lead to Detective Stevens, who tasked an officer with digging into Miguel Serrano's background. At the Harrington estate, Caroline confronted George about the rumors of James's financial woes. "Did you ever cut him off?" she demanded. George denied it outright, though he admitted to having firm control over James's accounts, releasing funds only when he deemed James was using it responsibly. "I wanted him to learn the value of money," George snapped, "not just squander it on a whim." Caroline felt torn between empathy for her son and frustration at her husband's rigid approach. In truth, She had always suspected that limiting James's financial autonomy might create resentment. She herself often gave James small sums discreetly to buy supplies for his art projects or to attend specialized workshops. She never dared to question George openly, as he insisted James needed discipline to handle the Harrington empire someday. The deeper they dug, the more complex the picture became. James had been carrying burdens no one truly understood. A bright young artist trapped in a golden cage, he might have sought an escape, or he might have stumbled into something far more dangerous. The staff recalled nothing unusual except for a rising tension in James's demeanor in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had grown distant, lost in private thoughts. And then came another startling piece of information, a quietly delivered, anonymous tip about James's possible whereabouts. The caller hinted that James was seen in a rundown part of Glendale, near a neighborhood notorious for underground gambling. The tip ended abruptly, leaving the Harringtons to wonder, had James fallen into dangerous territory in his quest for independence? Detective John Stevens was skeptical about the anonymous tip at first. Calls of this nature often led to dead ends or were pranks seeking attention. Nonetheless, with no concrete leads, he decided to follow up. The rundown part of Glendale was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns and upscale boutiques the Harringtons frequented. It was an area with high crime rates, known for back-alley casinos operating in the shadows of dilapidated buildings. Stevens brought along Officer Parker, a seasoned local officer who knew the area well. Together, they canvassed dingy bars and shabby convenience stores, showing James's photo to anyone who would talk. Most shook their heads, but a teenage boy loitering outside a closed arcade recognized the face. He mumbled something about seeing James with a Hispanic man, perhaps Miguel Serrano, entering a backroom gambling den a few nights back. Then he got spooked and refused to elaborate. This news hit George Harrington like a gut punch, his precious son diving into the underbelly of the city. It seemed inconceivable. Yet, the evidence mounted. James had grown desperate for money, allied with questionable individuals, and possibly ventured into illicit activities. The father's initial anger at James for vanishing irresponsibly began to shift into alarm and a gnawing sense of paternal failure. Caroline, seeing George's distressed demeanor, tried to provide comfort. She urged him not to blame himself entirely. James was an adult, after all, with a mind of his own. But in the quiet hours after midnight, Caroline found herself weeping, wondering if she could have done more to guide her son. The mansion, once a place of lavish parties and cheerful staff, now echoed with tension and dread. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, carefully tiptoeing around the Harringtons to avoid drawing George's wrath or Caroline's tearful breakdowns. Natalie Anderson, meanwhile, took a different tack. She reasoned that if James had run afoul of criminals, a ransom request would surface sooner or later. But so far, no one demanded money. She also examined James's emails, granted with George's approval, to hack into his son's online accounts, though the legality was questionable. A series of cryptic messages came up from an address labeled only as TR. The emails hinted at a big secret. James had discovered about his family a secret that would change everything. The last email from TR read simply, "We need to meet. It's safer if you come alone." A swirl of questions arose in Natalie's mind. Who was TR? What secret had James discovered, and was it enough to make him disappear by choice or, worse, put him in danger? She confronted George about it, but he claimed ignorance. Caroline, equally shocked, had never heard of TR either. The staff recalled no visitors with those initials. A puzzle piece was missing. Despite the ominous setting of the downtown leads and the cryptic TREMAILs, no conclusive evidence indicated James's fate. Was he alive and well, simply hiding? Or was he ensnared in something too big to handle? The million-dollar question grew heavier with each day. James remained missing. Would they ever see him again? Days stretched into a tense week. The Glendale police kept searching, but the lack of direct evidence made the case frustratingly stagnant. George Harrington's impatience turned into open hostility. He accused Detective Stevens of incompetence and threatened to leverage his influence with the city's higher-ups. Stevens, though understanding the father's desperation, bristled at the insult. Such friction only slowed cooperation. Natalie Anderson found herself trying to bridge the gap, managing George's anger while also reminding the detective that every hour counted. Behind the scenes, George faced mounting pressures unrelated to James's disappearance. A major real estate deal in New York hinged on his availability, but he refused to leave Glendale. Investors grew anxious. Stocks in Harrington Enterprises began a slow but noticeable dip, fueled by rumors swirling around the missing heir. The press caught wind of James's disappearance, turning it into a front-page sensation. Paparazzi camped outside the estate gates, hoping to snap a photo of the distressed millionaire couple. The Harrington brand, once a beacon of affluence and stability, seemed on the brink of scandal. Caroline found herself torn between her roles as wife and mother. She attended press conferences with George but refused to speak, her sorrow etched on her face. At night, she worried that the media circus and relentless pressure might overshadow the genuine goal, finding James. Meanwhile, relatives and close family friends offered help, though some, like George's sister, Patricia Harrington, believed James might be staging a very public rebellion. In the midst of these mounting tensions, a new clue emerged. James's bank account had a suspicious withdrawal 2 days before his disappearance. Large sums of money were moved to an unknown recipient. The timing suggested James might have been preparing to cut ties or pay off a looming debt. Natalie Anderson dug deeper, discovering that the transfer was made through an obscure online payment service, leaving no direct trace of the recipient's identity. The family's lawyer, Andrew Copeland, stepped in to help interpret the legal ramifications. If James transferred such a large amount, it might indicate he voluntarily disappeared. Yet, Copeland also raised the prospect of extortion. Maybe someone threatened him, he suggested to George, someone who didn't want James running to the authorities. As worry escalated, George grew increasingly paranoid. He cast suspicion on everyone, the staff, James's friends, even Caroline's acquaintances. At one point, he interrogated William Stark himself, demanding to know if William had overheard any phone calls or seen suspicious visitors. William, steadfast and loyal, endured the barrage of questions, but the implications stung. He had faithfully served the family for decades, never once betraying their trust. All the while, time trudged on without any sign of James. The lines between victim, perpetrator, and unwitting participant blurred. If James was in danger, why had no one demanded money yet? If he left by choice, why sever all communication, leaving his mother in anguish? The contradictions spiraled, each possibility heavier than the last. And somewhere in the shadows, TR lingered like a phantom, an unseen figure who might hold the key to the entire mystery. The break came in an unlikely form, an offhand comment by a friend of James's from art school. Natalie managed to track down Benjamin Price, a fellow photographer who'd occasionally collaborated with James. Over a cup of coffee in a quiet campus library, Benjamin revealed that James once confided a startling secret about his father's business dealings. He said his family's wealth might not be as clean as it looked. Benjamin mentioned hesitantly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. He was talking about off-the-record deals, bribery, and hush money. I didn't believe him. I mean, it's George Harrington, a legitimate real estate mogul, right? Benjamin's statement cast new light on the cryptic email from TRCOULD. TR have been a whistleblower or someone providing James evidence of wrongdoing. If so, Was James planning to expose his father's alleged shady operations, or use that knowledge to free himself from George's control? Natalie filed these possibilities away, determined to get to the root of the story. Detective Stevens, initially skeptical of corporate conspiracy theories, checked Harrington Enterprises' financial records more closely. Under normal circumstances, such thorough scrutiny would require subpoenas and a lengthy legal process. But with George's tacit cooperation, born from desperation, some documents were made available. Nothing screamed illegal transactions at first glance, yet the labyrinthine nature of corporate finances suggested potential hidden trails. Shell companies, overseas ventures, and unexplained write-offs raised eyebrows, though no direct link to James's disappearance emerged. As if this were not enough, Caroline stumbled on a discovery of her own. Late one evening, she was rifling through the drawers in George's study, searching for any clue or letter that might hint at James's whereabouts. Beneath an old business contract, she found a faded photograph of George, with a young boy, definitely not James, taken roughly 15 years prior. On the back were the words, "My son, Trevor Remington." Caroline felt her heart skip a beat. George had never mentioned a child named Trevor. Was this a hidden child, an affair from before or during their marriage? The revelation left her trembling, uncertain whether to confront George directly. The possibility that James had discovered a half-brother and that TR might stand for Trevor Remington now seemed chillingly real. At dinner that night, Caroline was withdrawn. She hardly touched her food, her eyes flicking nervously at her husband, who was too distracted with phone calls to notice. When she finally mustered the courage to approach him, George brushed her off. "I'm busy, Caroline. We can talk in the morning," he said, disappearing into his office. Deeply disturbed, Caroline locked herself in James's room, where she spent hours staring at the photograph, tears blurring her vision. If TR was indeed Trevor Remington, why had George kept it a secret for so long? Most importantly, did James discover he had a half-brother, perhaps explaining his anxious, distressed behavior in recent weeks? The final question was the most pressing. Could Trevor Remington's existence be linked to James's disappearance? Caroline confronted George the next morning, brandishing the photograph like a damning piece of evidence. The normally composed patriarch turned pale. For once, George Harrington, the man who commanded boardrooms without flinching, looked genuinely trapped. He led Caroline into the study and quietly shut the door. His voice trembled with reluctant admission. Yes, he had a son from a brief affair. In his early 30s, a relationship he had tried to bury to protect his reputation and ensure that it wouldn't harm his legitimate family life. "I provided for him financially, off the books," George explained, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But I never intended to bring him into our lives. I couldn't. It would have ruined everything." Caroline's eyes brimmed with betrayal. She demanded to know if James had discovered Trevor and if that was why he left. George shrugged helplessly, saying he had no idea James even knew. Despite his claims, Caroline felt a surge of anger. "Do you understand what you've done?" she hissed. "You've lied to us, to James. And if he found out, he probably felt like everything you stood for was a facade. He's always questioned your integrity. Now it all makes sense." Stricken with shame, George sank into his leather chair. Rarely had he seemed vulnerable, but at that moment he appeared older, burdened by secrets that overshadowed the success he was so proud of. Caroline walked out, tears in her eyes, leaving him alone in the dimly lit study. Meanwhile, Detective Stevens and Natalie Anderson analyzed a lead pointing them to Trevor Remington, the TR, from the emails. They confirmed that a man named Trevor Remington existed in Glendale, living under humble conditions. Unemployed and struggling with addiction, Trevor had a rap sheet that included petty theft and minor drug charges. Word on the street suggested he'd recently come into some money. Stevens immediately suspected blackmail. Trevor might have approached James with damning evidence about George's business dealings or demanded hush money in exchange for secrecy about his parentage. When they tracked down Trevor's last known address, they found a run-down apartment building. The landlord said Trevor vanished about a week ago, around the same time James disappeared. The apartment was nearly empty, save for a dirty mattress and old newspapers. The only notable item was a scribbled note referencing a motel outside Glendale, perhaps. Trevor's next hideout. Stevens took the address, determined to check it out. Back at the Harrington estate, the tension between George and Caroline reached a boiling point. She threatened to leave if James wasn't found soon, accusing George of hiding more secrets. William Stark and the rest of the staff retreated to their quarters, uncomfortable with the echoing shouts. In the quiet corners of the mansion, rumors circulated that the Harrington empire itself was built on a fragile web of lies. And in the middle of it all, James remained missing caught, it seemed, between a father's hidden past, a half-brother's desperation, and possibly a far more tangled plan that had yet to fully surface. Detective Stevens set out for the motel outside Glendale, a grim, isolated building with a flickering neon sign that buzzed incessantly. Accompanied by Officer Parker, he questioned the motel manager, a bleary-eyed man in his 50s who remembered Trevor Remington checking in under an alias. Trevor had paid in cash, insisting on a corner room in the back. Several days ago, Trevor left abruptly in the middle of the night. A security camera captured grainy footage of him entering a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates. No sign of James in the video. Inside the vacant motel room, Stevens discovered traces of drug paraphernalia, empty liquor bottles, and a crumpled piece of paper listing sums of money next to the initials J.H. The sums were large, too large for typical blackmail from a man like Trevor. The detective hypothesized that James and Trevor may have been in contact, though in what capacity remained unclear. Was James willingly helping Trevor, or was Trevor extorting James? When news of this discovery reached George, he erupted. He lambasted Trevor as a parasite and demanded the police launch a statewide manhunt. Stevens reminded him that they couldn't just brand Trevor as a criminal without proof of wrongdoing. Furious at the detective's caution, George threatened to contact the mayor and the governor if necessary, ignoring Caroline's pleas to remain calm. Meanwhile, Natalie Anderson delved deeper into James's personal life, suspecting that the young man might have orchestrated his own disappearance. A friend from the art school suggested James had, a month earlier, talked about a grand gesture he planned to make soon, something that would open everyone's eyes. Another friend hinted James might have grown increasingly paranoid, certain he was being watched or followed. Perhaps James was onto something about Harrington Enterprises, or maybe he was unraveling under personal pressures. Caroline tried reaching out to Rachel Summers again, but the young woman was just as clueless. She insisted that James had never spoken about a half-brother, though he often alluded to family secrets. Rachel sobbed, expressing guilt for not taking his cryptic words more seriously. "I just thought he was venting," she admitted. "I never imagined he'd do something drastic." Amid all these swirling theories, one detail stood out to Natalie: the timing. James transferred large sums of money, presumably to Trevor, just days before Trevor vanished. If James was forcing his father's hand to come clean or seeking to buy Trevor's silence, that plan had gone awry. Possibly, James tried to confront Trevor at the motel. Did an argument break out? Could James have been harmed? With no concrete evidence of foul play, it remained equally likely that James had left Glendale of his own accord. Yet, no credit card usage, no phone activity, and no sign that he purchased a bus or plane ticket. The puzzle was maddeningly incomplete. In hushed circles, speculation grew darker. Maybe James was dead, and no one had yet discovered the grim truth. But until that truth emerged, The Harrington family clung to hope that James might still be alive somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reappear. 1 week after James disappeared, events took a dramatic turn when George Harrington finally confronted his own misdeeds. Besieged by guilt and the fear that his secrets had driven James away, George opened up to Caroline, Detective Stevens, and Natalie Anderson all at once in his study. He admitted to funneling money to Trevor Remington over the years, but it wasn't just paternity hush money. George also used some of his overseas accounts to hide funds from certain business deals nothing he deemed terribly illegal, just grey areas that could ruin his reputation. Shaken and ashamed, he recounted how Trevor escalated demands, threatening to expose everything to the press. George confessed he had hoped to keep Trevor at bay with monthly payments until the man eventually disappeared. Instead, it was James who disappeared, likely after stumbling onto these financial trails while searching for answers about his father's real moral standing. Caroline stood in stunned silence, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You've risked our son's life for your empire," she whispered. The heartbreak in her voice resonated through the room, leaving George too distraught to defend himself. Detective Stevens listened intently, scribbling notes, while Natalie struggled to contain her anger at the brazen disregard for familial trust. If James had uncovered these darker truths, he might have confronted Trevor directly, or, in a misguided attempt to help, James might have funneled large sums of money to Trevor, hoping to buy him out and spare the family a public scandal. In a moment of candor, George also revealed that Harrington Enterprises was on the verge of a major federal audit for another real estate project. He had planned to shield the family from scandal by ensuring no traces of the questionable deals were found in official records. Now, with James missing and his half-brother in the wind, that carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "I'd do anything, absolutely anything, to ensure James's safety," George said, voice shaking. "I'd give up every penny just to have him home." Caroline, still furious, tried to find a thread of compassion in her heart. She understood that George's ambition grew from a desire to provide for them, but the web of deception he'd woven was staggering. "We need to fix this," she said finally, her gaze as unyielding as steel, "not just for James, but for all of us." Detective Stevens took immediate steps to expand the search beyond Glendale, coordinating with nearby cities to look for both Trevor Remington and James. He also filed for a warrant to freeze George's suspicious accounts, hoping that financial trails might reveal Trevor's location. George agreed to fully cooperate, though it was a humiliating blow to his ego and possibly his entire empire. Despite the resolution to come clean, the question of James's survival still loomed large. If Trevor was desperate enough to keep blackmailing Harrington, would he have harmed James to protect his leverage? Or was James complicit, forging a new path away from the father he no longer trusted? Time was running short. Every day that passed without contact fueled the fear that James might not return alive. The breakthrough arrived in the form of a frantic phone call. Late one evening, Detective Stevens received an urgent tip from a transient who claimed to have seen someone matching James's description with a disheveled man at a rundown cabin in the outskirts of Glendale. Natalie Anderson and Stevens raced to the location, passing miles of barren land and groves of eucalyptus trees until they reached a small wooden cabin with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Inside, they found a tense standoff. James Harrington, gaunt but alive, was standing against one wall, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and terror. Across from him was Trevor Remington, equally distraught, clutching a duffel bag. When the detective and Natalie burst in, Trevor threw up his hands in surrender. There was no weapon in sight, only the suffocating tension of two people pushed to their limits. Detective Stevens ordered Trevor to step away from the bag, which contained wads of cash. The detective radioed for backup as Natalie rushed to check on James. Shaken, James managed a weak smile. "I'm okay," he whispered. "He didn't hurt me. We just needed time to figure things out." Trevor, eyes brimming with guilt, admitted to blackmailing George. He hadn't intended to harm James. In fact, James had shown up unannounced, offering more money to keep Trevor silent, on the condition that Trevor stop harassing George and vanish. But something more profound had happened in that dingy cabin. The two half-brothers had spent days talking, arguing, crying, revealing the truth about their shared father. Trevor learned that James held no ill will toward him personally. His anger was directed at the father who lied to them both. Over those days, they reached a strange kind of understanding. Each felt cast off by George Harrington, each searching for a sense of identity free from the legacy that bound them. James refused to contact his parents or the police, fearing that Trevor would be arrested immediately if they showed up. He believed that by handling it privately, he could help Trevor restart his life away from Glendale. At the same time, James himself struggled with the betrayal he felt toward George. The plan was to quietly finalize their arrangement. Trevor would take some money and leave the state. James would return on his own terms once he sorted through his emotions about the family secrets. In the end, the arrival of Stevens and Natalie cut that plan short. Trevor was taken into custody for attempted extortion. James, trembling, finally realized how worried his mother and father must have been. He clung to the detective's arm, grateful to be rescued from a scheme that had spiraled beyond his control. As they led Trevor to the squad car, he and James exchanged a silent nod, an odd camaraderie forged in the crucible of a broken family. Nothing would be the same now that this truth had come to light. But at least one question found resolution. James was alive, and the Harrington family could begin to pick up the shattered pieces. News of James's safe return spread quickly. Under the flashing lights of reporters' cameras, a visibly shaken but relieved Caroline hugged her son tightly as he stepped out of the unmarked police car at the Harrington estate. George, tearful and uncharacteristically humble, stood nearby. They ushered James inside, away from the paparazzi that had gathered at the gates. For the first time in days, the great mansion buzzed with a sense of relief rather than dread. Yet, amid the emotional homecoming, tensions between James and George remained palpable. That first night back, Caroline tried to keep the mood light, ordering a quiet family dinner of James's favorite meal, roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes. But the conversation around the table was stilted, overshadowed by unspoken questions. James merely picked at his food, lost in thought. Finally, in a small parlor off the main hallway, James confronted his father face to face. Caroline lingered in the doorway, ready to intervene if tempers flared. "Why didn't you tell me?" James demanded, voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. "All my life you made me feel like the disappointment. But you lied about Trevor, you lied about your business deals, and you never gave me the freedom to be who I wanted to be." George had no easy answers. He admitted to his failings, explaining that his obsession with success had blinded him to the needs of those closest to him. "I wanted a perfect family, a legacy," he said quietly, "and I thought burying my mistakes was the only way to protect you. I never realized how much harm I was causing." For James, hearing his father's confession was a bittersweet victory. Part of him wanted to storm out and never look back, yet another part yearned to forgive. After hours of difficult conversation, father and son reached a tentative truce. George vowed to make amends by being transparent about his finances and, more importantly, allowing James to chart his own path in life. The path to reconciliation would be long, but at least a door had opened. In the days that followed, George publicly acknowledged that he had an illegitimate son and was cooperating with a federal audit into certain questionable business transactions. The media frenzy that ensued threatened to tarnish the Harrington name further, but in an odd way, the honesty softened public perception. Caroline issued a statement asking for privacy while the family healed. Investors in Harrington Enterprises responded with mixed emotions. Some pulled out, fearing scandal, while others admired the attempt at honesty, hoping George's empire would weather the storm. As for James, he retreated to a private villa in the countryside for a few weeks, accompanied by Caroline, to find emotional respite. There, he focused on painting landscapes, translating his tumultuous experiences into bold strokes of color. His ambition was no longer shaped by a father's demands, but by his own desire to create and find meaning beyond wealth. And so, while the Harrington family's illusions of perfection lay in ruins, a glimmer of hope shone through. Sometimes, only after the storm passes can one truly see the path to a more authentic future. In the weeks following the scandal, life in Glendale shifted for the Harringtons. The estate remained grand, but a subdued atmosphere replaced the old pomp. The staff, once cautious about speaking of the ordeal, found small ways to express relief that James was home and safe. William Stark, the loyal caretaker, tried to brighten the mansion's mood by arranging fresh flowers in every corridor. Henry Gibson, the chauffeur, offered a quiet word of support whenever he caught James heading out for a drive. But inside the family, changes ran deeper. George Harrington worked closely with federal investigators, handing over key documents that outlined his previous financial misdeeds. It was a humbling process. The man who once prided himself on controlling every aspect of his business now found himself under scrutiny by faceless auditors and stern-faced agents. With each signed affidavit, George felt a part of his old self fall away. Yet strangely, it also felt freeing not having to hide, not having to maintain the facade. Caroline dedicated herself to philanthropic work in the city, aiming to restore some goodwill toward the Harrington name. She channeled her grief and relief into tangible contributions, funding art scholarships at the local college, one named specifically in honor of James and his unwavering passion. She also established a foundation to support therapy and resources for families dealing with hidden secrets and mental health strains. James, meanwhile, spent his afternoons painting at the family's countryside villa. The once luxurious living quarters became a rustic studio filled with half-finished canvases, tubes of paint, and the lingering smell of turpentine. His artwork took on a new emotional depth, moody abstracts and stormy landscapes, all echoing the inner turmoil he had experienced. Caroline, visiting weekly, saw in his paintings a journey toward healing. Though their relationship remained delicate, mother and son grew closer through shared vulnerability. Detective John Stevens and Natalie Anderson turned their attention to the remaining loose ends. Trevor Remington faced charges for extortion, but during his interviews with law enforcement, he insisted that he never intended to harm James. The courts, recognizing the complicated family dynamics and Trevor's own struggles with addiction, offered a plea deal involving rehabilitation and restitution. For James's sake, and perhaps guided by guilt, George agreed to assist Trevor financially in seeking treatment. The arrangement was controversial, but for a father trying to atone, it seemed the right thing to do. The final piece of the puzzle, why James stayed hidden rather than contacting anyone, traced back to the intense shame and sorrow he felt upon discovering his father's betrayal. "I needed space," he explained in a heartfelt conversation with Caroline. "Space to decide if I even wanted to be a Harrington anymore." Over time, James came to realize that one's identity could encompass painful truths without being entirely defined by them. He didn't have to replicate George's mistakes, nor did he have to sever ties completely. The future, he discovered, lay in carving his own path, truthfully and unapologetically. No story ends neatly, and neither did the Harringtons. Legal battles, therapy sessions, and internal reflection loomed on the horizon. But for the first time, father, mother, and son moved forward with honesty, an unfamiliar but liberating step into a new beginning. Months passed, and with each turn of the calendar page, the Harrington family adapted to a life post-scandal. George found himself learning the humbling art of apology, not just to his family, but also to business partners and employees whose trust he had eroded. Some parted ways, but others stayed, drawn by a sense that George Harrington was genuinely trying to rebuild on more ethical grounds. Gone were the ostentatious galas and constant photo ops. In their place, intimate gatherings took hold, small dinners with close friends, heartfelt charity events with limited guest lists, and private moments that reminded the Harringtons what truly mattered. With cameras less interested in the ongoing drama, the estate settled into a quieter routine. The federal audit concluded with hefty fines and stern warnings, but no prison time for George, thanks in large part to his cooperation. Trevor Remington completed a stint in rehab. Afterward, he began volunteering at a local community centre, hoping to mend his own life. Though still wary, James visited him once, a gesture symbolizing a cautious acceptance of their shared bloodline. Their relationship was far from normal, but the anger and desperation that once defined them began to ease. Meanwhile, James decided to host a small exhibition of his paintings at a local art gallery run by an old professor. The proceeds would support mental health initiatives in Glendale, an idea inspired by his own emotional journey. On the night of the opening, Caroline stood by his side, beaming with pride. Even George showed up, standing in the background, unsure if his presence would be welcomed. Yet James greeted him, offering a soft, genuine smile. It felt like a fragile step toward reconciliation, a new father-son dynamic based on mutual respect rather than obligation. During the exhibition, James unveiled a centerpiece painting titled Truth Unbound, an abstract depiction of tangled shapes dissolving into rays of light. Observers were struck by its raw emotion. To James, it represented his own liberation from secrets and the possibility that darkness could give way to clarity if one dared to face it. The gallery buzzed with admiration, selling several pieces at respectable prices. It wasn't about the money, though. For James, the true reward lay in channeling his pain into creativity and forging a deeper connection with the world. Caroline, who had quietly sold some of her inherited jewelry to sponsor a few students in the newly formed James Harrington Art Scholarship, found renewed purpose. Her own transformation emerging from behind George's shadow symbolized the family's shift toward individuality and authenticity. No longer simply a socialite hostess, she became a mentor for aspiring young artists, offering them both financial support and moral encouragement. For George, each day became a careful balancing act between atonement and forward momentum. Rebuilding Harrington Enterprises with integrity was daunting, but also strangely invigorating. Slowly, he realized that true success isn't measured by magazine covers or the size of one's estate, but by the respect and love one fosters in those who matter. The Harrington story was no longer about a missing millionaire's son, but rather about a family mending fractures through truth and empathy, proof that it's never too late to change, no matter how far one has strayed. A year after James Harrington's disappearance and miraculous return, the sun shone differently on the Glendale estate, gentler, somehow as if acknowledging a newly healed atmosphere. The final vestiges of the scandal had faded, replaced by a hesitant respect from locals and the media for the Harringtons' journey toward accountability. George Harrington's transformation became evident at a press event announcing a new affordable housing initiative. Instead of boasting about profit margins, he highlighted the moral obligation to help families in need. Cameras still clicked, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer about glorifying wealth, but about giving back. Even the reporters, once hungry for damning quotes, found themselves surprisingly moved by George's sincerity. Caroline stood beside him, politely smiling as she remembered the days when public events revolved around lavish displays. Now, she was content with modesty, focusing her attention on philanthropic endeavors and supporting James's artistic pursuits. As she looked at her husband addressing the crowd, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. They had endured chaos and heartbreak, yet emerged with something resembling wisdom. James, meanwhile, had taken a sabbatical from his art institute to travel. He visited Europe for a few months, exploring the museums of Paris and Florence, absorbing inspiration from masters he had only read about. On weekends, he'd send postcards to Caroline with sketches scrawled on the back pictures of sunlit cathedrals, bustling cafes, and serene coastlines. In each line and curve, Caroline saw her son's spirit blossoming, freed from the weight of hidden truths. The Glendale Police Department recognized Detective John Stevens for his handling of the high-pressure case. Stevens, ever modest, credited tenacious teamwork and privately confessed to Natalie Anderson that he learned an important lesson about the depths of family secrets. Natalie, in turn, parted ways with the Harringtons on good terms, her agency's reputation further solidified by the high-profile resolution. She left Glendale for a new investigation overseas, her thirst for solving mysteries never quenched. As for Trevor Remington, he quietly rebuilt his life in a smaller town a few states away. The name Harrington no longer loomed over his every thought. Though he and James rarely spoke, the lines of communication remained open. Neither man wished to erase their bond, however complicated it was. Perhaps in time they might rediscover each other, not as adversaries or blackmailers, but as brothers walking separate paths. On a warm spring afternoon, James returned from his travels, surprising Caroline at the countryside villa. They sat on a porch swing overlooking rolling hills, a gentle breeze stirring the tall grass. James opened a notebook, showing sketches of future painting concepts. One, in particular, captured Caroline's attention, a portrayal of two silhouettes casting a single shadow set against a sunrise. James planned to title it Rebirth, a final testament to his belief that new beginnings often emerge from the darkest nights. Caroline squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her eyes glimmering with genuine joy. In that moment, they both understood that the trials they endured, while painful, had shattered illusions and replaced them with something far more valuable: hope, love, and the courage to be honest no matter the cost. Conclusion: approximately 150 words. And so ends the extraordinary saga of James Harrington's disappearance and the stunning truths it unearthed. A family that once stood as a polished emblem of success realized that real strength lies not in hiding mistakes, but in facing them head-on. Secrets were exposed, relationships tested, and a new future forged, one guided by honesty and compassion instead of power and prestige. If this story moved you, helped you reflect, or simply kept you on the edge of your seat, we'd love for you to become part of our journey. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe in second chances, and share this tale with others who might find hope in it. Most importantly, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us all sometimes we have to lose everything to finally find ourselves.